Salamun Alaykum, everyone. Before I get started on the actual content of this video, just want to thank everybody thus far who has supported my channel, who has watched it, whether criticizing it or whatever. I'm just glad that you have been tuning in. Just a disclaimer, because I had someone comment about editing the video. Just want to let you guys know that this is straight off the cuff. You know, I'm just speaking to you guys for roughly about a half hour each video. I just have some notes on my iPad here of the verses that I use or the certain topics that I want to note to myself to make sure I bring up throughout the video. But other than that, this is not scripted. It's straight off of my mind and it's not rehearsed. I do not edit the videos after recording them. I just put them up there. For whatever reason, my camera, after about 30 minutes, stops and I have to create a new recording. So other than merging the two videos together, I do not do any editing in that regard. So I hope you can appreciate that if I stumble over my words a little bit. Whatever the case may be, this is just a straight raw footage for you guys. So today I'm going to be discussing a popular argument that our Sunni brethren typically use to support their claim for the necessity of Sunnah or Hadith. And one of these arguments is what I'm going to refer to as the book and the wisdom argument. And this is typically used, it's mentioned about 4 times in the Quran. So I'm just going to read one of them right now, and that's in Surah 2, Ayah 151. It says, "Even as we have sent among you a messenger from among you, who recites to you our messages and purifies you and teaches you the book and the wisdom and teaches you that which you did not know." So Sunnis typically bring up this verse to say that the book and the wisdom is the Quran and the Sunnah. You see? So that the Prophet Muhammad was given the book, in this case, which refers to the Quran, and the wisdom, which refers to the Sunnah. So therefore they claim that by neglecting this so-called wisdom that he also received, you're neglecting the Sunnah, which goes against this verse and the 3 others where it is mentioned. So I'm going to now investigate that claim to see if it has any merit. How should we actually understand what this term, the wisdom, means in this context and how it's used throughout the Quran? So let's take a look at that. First, I want to go to chapter 4, verse 113, where similar wording is being used. It says, "And were it not for Allah's grace upon thee," speaking of the Prophet Muhammad, "and his mercy, a party of them had certainly designed to ruin thee, and they ruin only themselves, and they cannot harm thee in any way. And Allah has sent down to thee the book and the wisdom, and taught thee what thou knewest not, and Allah's grace on thee is very great." So the same thing that the messenger is said to do and bring us, the book and the wisdom, and teach us what we didn't know, Allah did for him. You see, because he was dalal, he was astray. He didn't know what the book or faith was. So just want to make that clear that the same thing Allah did for the messenger. Okay? Now, just off the bat, the thinking behind this argument is that because there's a wa or conjunction, meaning and, between the book and the wisdom, that somehow necessitates that these are 2 separate and distinct things or entities, the book and the wisdom. However, if we actually apply that logic in this verse 4:113 and also 2:151, which they use for their argument, we see that you wind up with three sources, which they don't believe, and it really falls apart. Because if you notice, it says, we revealed to thee the book and the wisdom, and taught thee what thou knewest not. So is that a third entity? Is that a third thing that the messenger was taught and that he is to teach us? That it's the book and the wisdom, and he's going to teach us what we knew not? Well, obviously not. Obviously, him teaching us what we didn't already know is the application of receiving the book and the wisdom, whatever that actually is, you see. By him proclaiming the Quran to us, we are being taught what we didn't know, all right? And in the Quran, it says Allah is the teacher of the Quran, you see. So, now, let's take a look and investigate whether or not the wisdom actually is separate from the Quran. Now, I want to tell you to turn to Surah 2, verse 231. Okay? It says, and when you divorce women and they reach their prescribed time, then retain them in kindness, or set them free with kindness, and retain them not for injury, so that you exceed the limits. And whoever does this, he indeed wrongs his own soul. And take not Allah's messages for mockery. And remember Allah's favor to you, and that which he has revealed to you of the book and the wisdom, admonishing you thereby, and keep your duty to Allah, and know that Allah is the knower of all things. So we see here that it's mentioned, okay, first of all, it says that the book and the wisdom were sent down to you, plural. It's not speaking only of the messenger in this case, it's speaking to us as Muslims, okay? It says that the book and the wisdom were sent down to you, plural, meaning us. So we have access to whatever this book and wisdom is, not just the messenger. So in that case, it already nullifies the wisdom being directly equivalent to the Sunnah of Muhammad, because we already have this. It's sent down to us, not just to him. You see? Then it says, admonishing you thereby, bihi, which is a singular term. It's not plural. If it were plural, denoting the two things mentioned, it would have been bihima. Okay, it wouldn't be bihi, which is a singular term. So two things are mentioned, the book and the wisdom, and then Allah says he admonishes you thereby with a singular term. So that goes to show that the two things being mentioned are really only one thing, which, as we'll see, is the Quran. So this goes to show that the fallacy of thinking that just because the word and is there, that it somehow denotes two separate and distinct things. Well, no, Allah mentions these two things, and then he says he admonishes you with one. So are you going to say that he only admonishes you with the book, or he admonishes you and instructs you with only the wisdom? You don't want to go that route as a Sunni, because you're saying one is the Quran and one is the Sunnah, which you say you need both. The only way out of this box now is to conclude that they're both the same thing. And therefore, that's why Allah is denoting two things with a singular term. Okay? Now, this business about wisdom somehow being the Sunnah of Muhammad, what other way can we go to disprove that? Well, let's take a look at chapter 3, verse 79. Okay? And the next set of verses that I'm going to give are going to show that not only did the Prophet Muhammad receive this so-called wisdom, but all prophets received the book and the wisdom. So if these prophets preceded Muhammad and they received the wisdom, and you're equating the wisdom with the sunnah of Muhammad, then that would make absolutely no sense. How did they have access to knowledge of someone's sunnah that came after them and that they were somehow implementing and following that? It just really breaks down at that point and becomes absurd. So in chapter 3, verse 79, it says, "It is not meet for a mortal that Allah should give him the book and the wisdom and the prophethood. Then he should say to men, be my servants besides Allah's, but he would say, be worshippers of the Lord because you teach the book and because you study it." Now again, in 2 verses later, in Surah 3, verse 81, it says, "And when Allah made a covenant through the prophets, certainly I have given you the book and the wisdom. Then a messenger comes to you verifying that which is with you. You shall believe in him and you shall aid him. He said, do you affirm and accept my compact in this matter? They said, we do affirm. He said, then bear witness, and I too am of the bearers of witness with you." So this is speaking of all previous prophets being mentioned as receiving the book and the wisdom. So obviously they didn't receive the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, some Sunnis might want to say, well, when it's speaking of the wisdom of Muhammad, it's his sunnah. When it's speaking the wisdom that these other prophets received, that was their sunnah. The problem with that is we have absolutely no evidence that these other prophets and messengers received something distinct from a revelation, such as a sunnah of Ibrahim or a sunnah of this person, in the sense that it was documented in books and was followed by those people. Now, we know that there was a significant amount of time between Jesus and Muhammad, okay? So you would think that if this method was applied throughout the previous prophet's history, that the people of their time followed their particular sunnah, well then how in the world did the people of Jesus up until Muhammad follow his sunnah? We have absolutely no documentation of that other than what's found in the so-called Injil. Which then you're going to have to say there's another thing besides the Injil, which is his sunnah, which they were supposed to be followed. Well, we have absolutely no evidence historically that these people believed in such a thing and that they were following it, and it was never documented. So it's proof that this concept was not a historical one. Okay? Also, in chapter 6, verse 89, to shore up this concept, starting at verse 83, and you can read it in context, but in the interest of time, I won't read all the verses. Starting at verse 83, it begins to name prophets. It says Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, David, Solomon, and so on. It mentions all the famous prophets that we know from the Quran. It caps it off at verse 89 by saying, these are they to whom we gave the book and the wisdom and prophecy. Therefore, if these disbelieve in it, we have indeed entrusted it to a people who are not disbelievers in it. So again, all these prophets that are mentioned in the previous verses leading up to verse 89 are clearly mentioned as receiving the book and the wisdom, okay, and prophethood or prophecy. So we see again this concept of the wisdom somehow equaling the sunnah of Muhammad makes no sense textually. Okay, now there are other specific examples where these prophets who are mentioned are singled out and mentioned as receiving the book and the wisdom. That's Jesus in chapter 3, verse 48. It's also repeated again with regards to Jesus in Surah 5, verse 110, and also Surah 43, verse 63. Now, another prophet that's mentioned is John in chapter 19, verse 12. It says, "O John, take hold of the book with strength, and we granted him the wisdom when a child." So John, the prophet, was somehow granted the wisdom at a child. Was that somehow the sunnah of Muhammad? It's just absurd. Doesn't make any sense, folks. And obviously I explained why it couldn't be his particular sunnah or the sunnah of others, because there's no evidence that that was the case and that people understood it that way, their followers at their time. In Surah 26, verse 83, it's mentioned in regards to Ibrahim. It says, "My Lord, grant me wisdom and join me with the righteous." So Ibrahim is asking for wisdom. Okay, so he received it. 28:14, Moses is mentioned as receiving this. It says, "And when he attained his maturity and became full grown, we granted him the wisdom and knowledge, and thus do we reward those who do good to others." So Moses was granted wisdom. Okay? He was granted the wisdom. Now, again, David in Surah 2, verse 251. We find there, it says, "So they put them to flight by Allah's permission, and David slew Goliath and gave him kingdom and the wisdom, and taught him of what he pleased. And were it not for Allah's repelling some men by others, the earth would certainly be in a state of disorder, but Allah is full of grace to the world." So again, David received the wisdom. And that's again mentioned with David in Surah 38, verse 20. Now, what about Abraham's family? In chapter 4, verse 54. It says, "Or do they envy the people for that which Allah has given them of his grace? But indeed we have given to Abraham's children," or family, "the book and the wisdom, and we have given them a grand kingdom." So what is the wisdom in this case? Okay, because we know that Abraham's children or family, okay, lived at the same time as Abraham. So did they each have their own individual wisdom or so-called sunnah? Or did they all follow Abraham's? Or was it the sunnah of Muhammad that they knew about before they even knew he existed? I mean, it just begins to break down when you really analyze what the wisdom means textually based on the Quran alone. The whole concept just falls apart. So it really doesn't make any sense. Also in 45:16, interestingly, the children of Israel are mentioned as receiving the book and the wisdom. It says, "And certainly we gave the children of Israel the book and the wisdom and prophethood, and provided them with good things, and made them excel the nations." So did the children of Israel have their own sunnah? Did the children of Israel follow the sunnah of Muhammad without even knowing about him in that direct sense? Obviously not. Okay? Now, all those verses were to show that the wisdom was not something unique that the Prophet Muhammad received. All previous prophets received the book and the wisdom, and they taught people with this in this manner. And we know that obviously they weren't teaching people the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, so that was the goal, to show that wisdom is not unique to the Prophet Muhammad, but also other prophets had this. Now, is wisdom restricted to prophets? Because I showed that it wasn't restricted to one prophet, but is it restricted to prophets in general? Well, no. We see in chapter 2, verse 269, says he, speaking of Allah, he grants the wisdom to whom he pleases. And whoever is granted the wisdom, he indeed is given a great good, and none mind but men of understanding. So Allah says he grants the wisdom to whomever he pleases. Any normal common man can be granted the wisdom. And they don't each have their own sunnah. And they each, it's not obviously not referring to the sunnah of Muhammad here. Okay? So this verse goes to show that the wisdom is not restricted to prophets alone. Definitely not restricted to the Prophet Muhammad, and definitely not restricted to prophets as a whole. Now, let's take at another verse here where someone is mentioned as receiving the wisdom. And that's in 31:12. It says, and certainly we gave Luqman the wisdom, saying, give thanks to Allah, and whoever is thankful for his own soul, and whoever denies, then surely Allah is sufficient praise. Now, in the traditional Sunni tradition, Luqman is not, for the most part, recognized as a prophet. And that's evident in Ibn Kathir's commentary on this verse and others. He mentions that Luqman was a servant of Allah, but he was not to the status of prophet. And if that's the case, and you accept that, then if Luqman received the wisdom, then this concept of the wisdom being received only by the Prophet Muhammad or even prophets in general is null and void, because people who were in general and not prophets, such as Luqman, and as we saw with chapter 2, verse 269, are able to receive the wisdom without being prophets. Okay? Now, what was the wisdom given to Muhammad? Okay, forget about all the other prophets now. What actually was the wisdom given to Muhammad? Well, first of all, we have to understand this concept of Hakim. What is it? Okay? First, we want to see that Allah is mentioned as Al-Hakim. Okay? And that is in chapter 2, verse 32. It says, they said, glory be to thee. We have no knowledge but that which thou hast taught us. Surely thou art the knowing, the wise. So Allah is Al-Hakim. Allah is the wise. And we don't attain any knowledge except what he has taught us. That's why it says Allah is the teacher of the Quran. You see? So Allah is the wise. Now, in light of that, we know that the Quran is Allah's word. So because the Quran is Allah's word and Allah is Al-Hakim, his word now, Allah mentions various attributes of himself that he actually applies to the Quran itself. Because if he has that attribute and it's his word, then his word is going to have that same attribute. And we have evidence of this in Surah 10, verse 1. Speaking about what the Quran is. It says, I, Allah, am the seer. These are the verses of the book full of wisdom. So the book is mentioned and the wisdom. And what is it called? It's called Al-Kitab Al-Hakim. Okay? So it's the wise book. It's not the book and the wisdom. It's the wise book. So this is an attribute of the Kitab. Okay? Again, in chapter 31, verse 2. Says these are the verses of the book of wisdom. Kitab Hakim. Okay? The book of wisdom. It's not the book and the wisdom. It's the book of wisdom. It's the wise book. Now we'll see more why that actually is. Chapter 36, verse 2. Now before we had Kitab Hakim, in 36:2 it says, by the Quran full of wisdom. It says, Al-Quran Al-Hakim. The Quran full of wisdom. You see? So it's not the Quran and Sunnah or and the wisdom. It's that the Quran is full of wisdom. It's the wise Quran. Okay? Now, the reason, as I said, is because it's Allah's word. Allah is Al-Hakim. So in virtue of that, His word has the attribute of being the wise. Now, and obviously that's because it contains wisdom. Let's take a look at chapter 17, starting at verse 22. What is the wisdom that Muhammad actually received? And this is proof of it. Now, I don't have time because of interest of time, but if you want, you can start in your Quran at chapter 17, verse 22, and read down until verse 39, which is the key verse that I want you to look at. It says, this or that, dhalika, that, speaking of what just preceded it, is of the wisdom which thy Lord has revealed to thee, speaking to Muhammad. And associate not any other God with Allah, lest thou be thrown into hell, blamed, cast away. So there's no need to question now as to what the wisdom is. Starting at 17, verse 22, you read down to verse 39, and Allah says, dhalika, meaning that which preceded what is just being said now, is the wisdom, is of the wisdom, okay, that you received, that was sent down to thee, okay? So a portion of the wisdom that Muhammad received is in this verses. Now, why is it only a portion? Because as we saw, the entire Quran is Hakim, is full of wisdom. Every verse is full of wisdom. So that's why it's not said that this is the only wisdom that you received, because it's only a portion of the Quran. But the Quran as a whole is the wisdom that the Prophet received. Okay? So we have to be clear that this shows what the wisdom is that he received, and it was not something distinct from the Quran. It was the Quran itself. It's not some sunnah that's different from this. Okay? So this shows you cannot separate the wisdom from the Quran or the book and the Quran wa Sunnah. You can't separate them now, because now at this point you have to admit that the wisdom is included within the Quran, or at least a part of it. So now the clear-cut distinction between the kitab and the wisdom, the book and the wisdom, just melts away. It's just superficial, you see? But when you actually investigate it, it doesn't exist in reality. Now, let's take a look at Surah 57, verse 25. Says, certainly we sent our messengers with clear arguments and sent down with them the book and the measure, or the balance, that men may conduct themselves with equity. And we sent down iron, wherein is great violence and advantages to men, and that Allah may know who helps him and his messengers unseen. Surely Allah is strong, mighty. So it says Allah sent down to his messengers the book and the balance, or the measure. So now we have a problem. If you think that and completely denotes something distinct from the book in the case of the book and the wisdom, then you would have to say that all messengers received the book and the balance, whatever that is. And now you have a third source. So you have the kitab wa hikmah, and now you have the balance added. So you have a trinity now. You have a trinity of sources. You don't only have the book and the wisdom. You have the book, the wisdom, and now the balance. Now what is that? Obviously, Sunnis don't even understand it that way. They understand that it's part of the book, which is obvious, okay? Muhammad didn't receive the book, the hikmah, or the wisdom, which is his so-called sunnah, and the balance, which is now a third source, which I don't know what you're going to call that, okay? So, again, it's just another example of where this concept of the book and the wisdom being distinct completely breaks down. Now, the last verse that I'm going to recite to you guys today is Surah 16, verse 125. It says, "Call to the way of thy Lord with the wisdom and goodly exhortation, and argue with them in the best manner. Surely thy Lord knows best him who strays from his path, and he knows best those who go aright." Now, everyone who gives dawah or knows the Quran knows that even the traditionalists, so-called traditionalists, the Sunnis, use this verse as a springboard for the dawah, a way for them to know how to give dawah and call to Allah. Okay? And this is first directed, because it's used in the singular form, to the messenger himself, but it also applies to us today, of course. Now, in this verse, okay, it says, "Call to the way of thy Lord with the wisdom." You see? Now, in light of us now knowing what the wisdom is, it's the contents of the Quran, because the Quran is Al-Quran Al-Hakim, okay? We know now, based on this verse, we are only to call to Allah alone, with the Quran alone. You see? And this is something that the messenger had to use during his time, and that we are to use today. So even this verse alone shows the authority of the Quran alone, and that nothing else is needed. You see? Okay? So if we wanted to interpret it as you guys do, as the wisdom somehow being equivalent to the Sunnah of Muhammad, we would have to understand this verse as saying, "Call to the way of thy Lord with the Sunnah," which would, if it's distinct from the Quran, if it's distinct from the book, well, then that wouldn't make any sense, and we don't need the Quran. We just need the Sunnah of Muhammad, which obviously you guys do not believe in. So I'm just showing this as an argument from absurdity to show that your position breaks down upon analysis of the term Hakim in the Quran, and we see that it's not what you guys understand it to be and what you interpret it to be. Okay? So I want to thank you all for watching. I hope that you can share this video with your Sunni friends. I'm sure that my Quran alone, so-called Quran alone brethren out there are typically hit with these kind of verses about the book and the wisdom all the time. Hopefully this material is useful for you in order to know how to properly respond to this argument, and that you can hopefully get this video out there and share it with them, so maybe they will turn back from this argument and realize that it's actually not accurate and true to the text of the Quran. So in light of that, I want to invite you all to please subscribe to my channel. I'm going to have great material coming out in the future, inshallah. Like this video, comment on it if you feel that you would like to and feel obliged to, and please share it, get it out there, get this message out to as many people as we can. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Unfortunately, I'm going on vacation soon, so I won't be making a video for at least the next 3 or 4 weeks. I'm not going to be home. I'm going to be out of the state. So don't be alarmed if you don't see me putting up a video, as I typically put up a video every week. All right, well, thank you all for watching, and look forward to a new video soon, inshallah. Salamun Alaykum.